He never imagined that the next sunrise would illuminate the darkest chapter of his life. The sun rose slowly on a day that seemed ordinary, but was, in fact, drawing ever closer to an inevitable end. Dawn broke with a gentle glow that crept through the blinds of David Fuller's modest home. The first rays of light revealed the faint outlines of a life caught between routine comforts and looming tragedy. Outside, the world appeared serene, streets still empty, the soft hum of distant traffic barely audible in the crisp morning air. And in that near silence, he stirred awake, unaware that the final 24 hours of his existence had just begun ticking by. From an outside perspective, he appeared calm, methodical even. At precisely 6:30, his alarm broke the silence. No frantic scrambles, no restless tossing. Only a measured quiet as he sat up in bed and stepped into another day. The morning light illuminated the small details that defined him. A half-read book on the nightstand, neat rows of clothes folded in a dresser, and a carefully arranged stack of papers hinting at responsibilities that once seemed so significant. Yet, if one looked closer, tension lay beneath the surface. These final hours were not shaped by the comforting rhythms of routine, but by an unseen force that hovered over him like a gathering storm. He moved to the kitchen, flicking on a dim overhead light that buzzed softly. A swirl of instant coffee accompanied by a single piece of toast, his breakfast ritual for as long as anyone could remember. On any other morning, this would have been unremarkable, but today it seemed symbolic, as though he was performing each simple act with an air of finality. He set the toast onto a plate, sipped the steaming coffee, and gazed out the window. Neighborhood cats skulked along fences, birds hopped on dewy lawns, and the postman began his rounds. An ordinary scene, unburdened by secrets. Yet secrets abounded. According to official accounts, records that would later be scrutinized by law enforcement, David Fuller had been under quiet observation for several weeks. The authorities, it was said, had reasons to believe his past was not as unblemished as his unassuming demeanor implied. Outside watchers might have speculated he sensed the scrutiny. Perhaps the faint lines of anxiety around his eyes were a sign that he felt an invisible gaze upon him. Still, he presented no explicit change in routine. No frantic phone calls, no flurry of text messages. Just the silent acceptance of a day that would turn extraordinary before it ended. Those few neighbors who noticed him that morning spoke of a reserved, almost pensive figure walking out to retrieve the mail. They observed how he paused at the front gate, looking momentarily at the horizon as though he were waiting for something or bracing for it. No greetings, no casual chats, just a nod toward the empty street. Unbeknownst to them, that fleeting moment marked one of his last sightings in the sunlight. The weight of suspicion, the knot of tension building behind closed doors. These would crescendo as the day advanced. While no outward signs of dread manifested in his polite, measured movements, the inner tremors grew more pronounced. For inside his home, documents and photos hinted at truths that he would not wish publicly revealed. The morning hours ticked by. As the sun climbed higher, so did the stakes of the final act in his life's drama. A faint expression of resignation lingered on his face, an almost imperceptible acknowledgement that the day would not follow the comfortable script it had in the past. These early morning glimpses, captured by witnesses and pieced together after the fact, painted a picture of a man whose facade of normalcy was cracking. Even if he momentarily believed he could proceed as usual, the unraveling had already begun. The world beyond his four walls continued in its own rhythm, but a sense of foreboding settled in the corners of his modest home. And as the sun's gentle light shifted from gold to the harsher brightness of late morning, one could almost sense that time was accelerating, carrying him closer to the final confrontation with his fate. As the hours pressed on, destiny had already been set in motion, unseen but unstoppable. By mid-morning, the pace of life around David Fuller's neighborhood had quickened. Cars swept along the streets more frequently, and the software of lawnmowers rose in the background as people attended to their daily chores. Amid this humdrum suburban ballet, Fuller stepped out onto his porch. From an outsider's vantage, he looked just like any other resident heading out on errands. Yet behind this unassuming facade, the tension coiled tighter. His first known stop that day, confirmed later by security cameras, was a local hardware store where he'd been seen in past weeks. Surveillance footage captured him entering at approximately 9:52 a.m., wearing a light jacket and carrying a worn leather wallet. He moved purposefully down the aisles, selecting a small item that, at first glance, seemed innocuous: a packet of industrial-grade zip ties. Employees who later reviewed the camera feeds noted nothing overtly unusual about his behavior. He did not rush, nor did he linger suspiciously. The banality of his purchase would only raise questions after the fact. That short trip, however, formed a critical piece in the puzzle of his final day. At around 10:30 a.m., he headed to a nearby cafe where he ordered a simple lunch to go, a sandwich and a bottled water. The cashier would recount how his eyes flickered with an intensity she couldn't quite place. He said almost nothing, handing over exact change before stepping out onto the sidewalk. No one would have guessed that this quick transaction could be part of something far more significant. Yet to those who would scrutinize the timeline later, these mundane interactions stood as potential clues. Did he know this would be his last meal in freedom? Or was it just the next checkpoint in a day overshadowed by suspicion? Phone records, obtained much later, indicated that Fuller received at least 2 calls in the early afternoon. While no transcripts exist, owing to legal restrictions at the time, investigators concluded from phone logs that these communications may have involved sensitive matters. Perhaps he was coordinating with someone, or maybe these were inquiries from concerned parties noticing subtle changes in his demeanor. Either way, by the time he emerged once more at around noon, there was a tangible shift in the air around him. The midday sun cast sharp shadows along the streets, reflecting the deepening sense of unease. Observers described him as looking over his shoulder more often than usual, as if acknowledging a silent watcher. Some suspected that the police, already gathering evidence, had placed unmarked cars nearby. Rumors began to swirl. Neighbors reported seeing unfamiliar faces in parked vehicles, while local chatter suggested a looming confrontation. Yet no direct move had been made against him. No uniformed officers approached his door, no formal accusations were issued that morning. Still, the tension simmered. Each step he took seemed heavy with apprehension. When he finally returned to his home, neighbors heard the scrape of his front door closing, the faint clink of a chain being secured. Inside, the blinds remained drawn. If anyone had been curious enough to peer through the windows, they might have glimpsed him pacing through the living room, occasionally pausing to sift through papers on a cluttered desk. A single overhead light glowed in that space, cutting through the dimness that seemed to shroud his entire house. Outside, life proceeded unremarkably. Delivery vans passed by. Children's laughter echoed from a nearby playground. In the afternoon, traffic ebbed and flowed. Yet within that quiet dwelling, time felt distorted, stretched thin by the weight of impending revelation. The digital clock on the kitchen counter ticked each minute with a relentless rhythm that contrasted sharply with the stillness in the air. At some point in the early afternoon, Fuller began shredding documents, an action witnessed solely through the thin walls by a neighbor who claimed to hear the mechanical hum of a paper shredder. Whether these documents held incriminating evidence or were merely personal records never made public, one can only guess. However, the urgency implied by the swift mechanical grinding signified a quiet panic. Something had forced his hand, and he was not taking any chances with what might be discovered if the day took the inevitable turn he feared. As the afternoon slid toward evening, the sun's rays grew warmer, illuminating dust motes dancing in the corridors of his mind. Outside the windows, the world spun on obliviously. Commuters returned home, families planned dinners, the day's news scrolled across television screens. David Fuller, however, stood at the precipice of a fate he could neither fully evade nor deny. Each mundane errand and phone call now glowed with ominous significance, weaving together the strands of the final tapestry of his life. As the hours crept toward dusk, the shadows lengthened, each one a silent herald of the darkness to come. Late afternoon light cast elongated silhouettes across David Fuller's living room floor. Outside, autumn leaves fluttered in a gentle breeze, their rich hues offering a deceptive comfort. By now, the broader context of the day had turned unmistakably ominous. The facade of normalcy that had carried him through the morning began to splinter, revealing a man in the throes of quiet desperation. At precisely 5:17 p.m., a timestamp later confirmed by security footage, he stepped out of his house once again. This time, there was a subtle difference in his demeanor. His eyes darted around, scanning the street corners and vehicles parked along the curb, as though expecting someone to emerge. No one confronted him. Nonetheless, an air of foreboding clung to him like a tangible weight. Neighbors would later recall a palpable tension in the air, as if the day itself were braced for a calamitous twist. David Fuller's next destination was a convenience store a few blocks away. A lone camera captured him walking briskly, shoulders slightly hunched, a black hoodie partially obscuring his features. He made a small purchase, some items that on their own seemed insignificant: a pack of batteries, a bottle of water, and a newspaper. All the while, his gaze flickered to the glass doors, the reflections of passers-by, the corners of the shop. The store clerk, remembering the odd energy he radiated, noted how his voice sounded strained when he politely declined a bag. After leaving the store, he seemed even more agitated. He paused just outside, glancing up and down the street, then continued walking at a measured pace toward a nearby park. This park, a peaceful place lined with benches and an aging fountain, provided a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing in his life. Once there, he lingered near a wooded area as if searching for solitude, or perhaps for someone else. Leaves crunched beneath his feet, and the last warm rays of the setting sun filtered through the trees, painting the scene in bittersweet gold. An outside observer might have likened it to the calm before a storm. A crucial detail from the public record indicated that, around 6:10 p.m., a figure matching Fuller's description was caught on a private surveillance camera near the park's edge. The figure seemed to be talking on a phone, though the call itself remained untraceable. That fleeting clip, dissected extensively after the fact, became a focal point of speculation. Some theorized that it was his final phone call to a contact who might have been pulling the strings from a distance. Others suggested it was a desperate attempt at explaining himself or seeking help. Whatever the reason, that call was the last digital footprint attributed to him before nightfall. As evening drew closer, the sky dimmed from pale orange to indigo. Streetlights began their automatic glow, illuminating pockets of the park in a soft halo. David Fuller eventually emerged from the wooded area, looking around as though he expected a confrontation. A distant dog barked, a car's headlights swept across the entrance, and the rustle of wind through the trees provided an eerie soundtrack to his mounting sense of dread. If he was on the run, he showed no sign of having a specific destination in mind. If he was planning a sudden departure, there was no suitcase or hurried packing. Only the barest essentials kept close to him. Back in the city center, CCTV captured sporadic sightings. A silhouette crossing a deserted street, a figure standing near the entrance of a shuttered post office, a man stepping off the curb seconds before a bus roared past. Each grainy frame fed into the story that would captivate the public in the days that followed. For now, however, these sightings were merely puzzle pieces, their true significance incomprehensible until the final piece fell into place. As the minutes ticked on, a silent tension stretched thin around him. Even the air felt charged, as though the wind itself carried whispers of what was to come. In the fading daylight, he appeared more as a haunted specter than a man simply going about his day. In many ways, that was precisely what he had become. A figure haunted by the inevitability of exposure, by the knowledge that whatever tightrope he had been balancing on was about to snap under the weight of truth. By the time darkness fully claimed the sky, David Fuller's fate loomed nearer. He walked the last steps of daylight with a posture that spoke of resignation, like someone who senses the net closing in but can do little more than trudge onward. Observers later described that twilight moment as the final calm before everything erupted, an almost cinematic pause that left the world poised on the brink of cataclysm. And then it happened. Fate's fragile thread snapped under the weight of inevitability. Night had settled over the quiet streets, transforming them into a canvas of glowing windows and muted headlights. If one listened closely, the sigh of the wind carried a foreboding undertone, as though nature itself sensed the imminent storm. Against this nocturnal backdrop, David Fuller reappeared on yet another surveillance feed, heading down a poorly lit alley. The timestamp read 8:42 p.m., and it was the last verified moment he was captured on camera while still upright, still breathing. From this point, the accounts become chaotic, a swirl of conflicting testimonies and patchy evidence. A few startled residents reported hearing shouts echo through the alleyway, but the words were indistinct. Others claimed they saw two silhouettes, one belonging to Fuller, the other unidentified, locked in a tense confrontation near the flickering neon sign of a closed pawn shop. Moments later came the sound that would forever reshape the narrative of his final hours. Two sharp cracks, echoing with lethal clarity through the stillness of the night. Emergency calls flooded the local police station almost immediately after those gunshots. When responders arrived at the scene, they found a crumpled figure on the ground, lifeless. Streetlights cast a harsh glow on the shocking tableau. Spent shell casings glinting on the pavement, a faint metallic smell hanging in the cold air. Within minutes, blue and red lights bathed the alleyway in staccato flashes, while uniformed officers cordoned off the area with yellow tape. Their voices were urgent but hushed, as though they were trying to maintain some semblance of order amid the chaos. A few onlookers, drawn by morbid curiosity, stood at the periphery, their expressions etched with shock and confusion. Authorities identified the victim as David Fuller on the spot. The presence of his wallet and ID left no room for doubt. This was the very individual who had prowled the city's streets just hours earlier, seemingly one step ahead of an unseen pursuer. Medical personnel arrived swiftly, but all they could do was confirm what was already apparent. No pulse, no signs of life. Preliminary observations suggested at least one bullet wound to the chest, possibly another to the abdomen. Speculation ran rampant. Was this a targeted hit, a desperate act of self-defense gone wrong, or something else entirely? Police combed the scene meticulously, photographing every angle and gathering whatever fragments of evidence they could find in the dimly lit passage. Bloodstains, footprints, and the scattered remains of a phone with a shattered screen all hinted at a violent end. Yet nothing explained precisely how or why the final confrontation unfolded. No suspect was immediately apprehended, and no definitive eyewitness stepped forward to piece together the final seconds. Official statements issued later that night confirmed the death, but withheld further details pending an investigation. In the subsequent days, rumors would circulate about a final confrontation that might have involved blackmail, hidden alliances, or even a dark chapter from Fuller's past catching up to him. Forensic experts meticulously analyzed the ballistic evidence, while detectives canvassed the area in search of any clue that might solve the puzzle. Every shred of fact only served to heighten public fascination. The man at the center of this frenzy was now gone, leaving behind a swirl of mysteries that seemed almost theatrical in their grim intensity. In the immediate aftermath, silence descended on the alley. Officers moved with solemn efficiency, chalk outlines and numbered markers turning the grim scene into a bizarre, methodical tableau. The city lights twinkled overhead, indifferent to the tragedies unfolding below. Before dawn broke again, David Fuller's body was transported to the coroner's office, where an autopsy would add new pieces to the puzzle. The immediate cause of death appeared clear: gunshot wounds inflicted at close range. Yet the deeper implications of his sudden end would fuel theories and speculation for months to come. Even at this stage, some insisted they glimpsed a hooded figure sprinting away right after the shots rang out. Others spoke of a parked car with its engine running, idling menacingly nearby. But in the confusion of those first critical minutes, certainty was scarce. What remained was the stark fact that David Fuller's life had concluded in violence, a swift collision with his destiny that left more questions than answers. In the hush that followed the gunfire, it was as though the entire city held its breath, aware that a story was closing and a new one, steeped in shock and intrigue, was about to begin. A figure once shrouded in quiet existence had fallen, and the ripple of that event shook the world beyond measure. News of David Fuller's death broke at dawn, saturating local broadcasts and quickly spreading to national outlets. Journalists, starved for a gripping headline, latched onto the sudden violence and the enigmatic circumstances surrounding his final hours. The morning news cycle buzzed with speculation, each station embellishing the story with newly uncovered scraps of information. Helicopters hovered above the alleyway where he had been found, their cameras transmitting images of the police cordon and forensic teams scouring for evidence. Tabloid papers featured his photo front and center, a grainy headshot from unknown origin, accompanied by bold print screaming questions. Was this the final reprisal? A secret past exposed? Who wanted David Fuller dead? A swirl of rumors took shape, feeding the public's fascination. Some hypothesized about a covert group that had targeted him, while others painted him as the victim of his own clandestine dealings. The headlines played to every emotion, turning the tragedy into a spectacle that fueled water cooler gossip and online forums alike. Authorities, overwhelmed by the sudden media onslaught, did their best to maintain a semblance of order. Official statements revealed little beyond the basic facts. David Fuller, identified by personal documents at the scene, had been fatally shot by an unknown assailant. No arrests had been made. There were no new leads they were prepared to share. Yet the reticence only heightened the sense of drama, prompting endless chatter about alleged conspiracies. Radio hosts fielded calls from listeners eager to share theories, and social media crackled with armchair detectives dissecting every angle of the limited evidence available. Meanwhile, the coroner's office released preliminary autopsy findings to the press. The report confirmed 2 bullet wounds, one to the torso, another near the lower abdomen. Death appeared to be instantaneous, caused by catastrophic internal bleeding. The bullets, fired from a small caliber handgun, were retrieved from Fuller's body, but the weapon itself remained missing. Forensic teams analyzed the trajectory, the residue patterns, and any potential traces of DNA left behind. Still, these details offered more questions than answers. Who had pulled the trigger and why? Speculation also turned to Fuller's background. While few concrete facts were provided about his personal life in official statements, reporters diligently dug through his past in search of something, anything, that could link him to this shocking end. Fragments emerged. He had once worked as an electrician, possessed certain technical skills, and might have been under some scrutiny by authorities in prior weeks. Yet no definitive account materialized, leaving the door wide open for sensational rumors to take root. Photographs of his modest home, now behind police tape, flooded social media with accompanying captions that ranged from empathetic to outright conspiratorial. Close neighbors were thrust into the media spotlight, pressed for any detail that could paint a clearer portrait. They described him as polite but reserved, a man of routine who rarely drew attention to himself. One or two recalled the tension in his eyes in those final days, a hint that trouble was brewing. But none could provide the missing piece that explained how a quiet existence had spiraled into a fatal confrontation. In the wake of the tragedy, a sense of collective shock gripped not just the neighborhood, but an audience far beyond its borders. The abruptness of his death, coupled with the absence of a definitive explanation, sparked a frenzy reminiscent of high-profile crime sagas that captivate entire nations. Television segments reenacted his last known movements, using silhouetted actors and ominous music to dramatize the final hours. News anchors interviewed retired detectives, criminologists, and anyone who might shed light on the lethal puzzle. Law enforcement found itself under intense pressure to deliver answers. Public confidence hung in the balance as rumors proliferated. Some speculated about organized crime ties, others about a personal vendetta that ended in bloodshed. Still others believed this was merely the random outcome of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But each hypothesis lacked definitive proof, and so the nation watched, transfixed, as the enigma surrounding David Fuller deepened. By the second day, the floral tributes that typically adorn high-profile crime scenes began appearing. A handful of bouquets lined the alleyway's entrance. Some notes expressed condolences, while others hinted at deeper alliances or cryptic messages. "You'll be missed. The truth will come out. Why so soon?" For many, these gestures only compounded the mystique of a man whose life and death were now the stuff of breaking news bulletins and countless online threads. The world had latched onto David Fuller's story, and it refused to let go, demanding an explanation that, for now, remained maddeningly elusive. But what truly happened? Was his death a mere twist of fate, or did a greater scheme unfold behind the scenes? In the immediate aftermath of David Fuller's violent end, a maze of questions remained unanswered. Despite days of frenzied investigation, no suspect had been named, no definitive motive established. Over time, the vacuum of official facts allowed rumors and theories to metastasize. Some believed he had stumbled upon incriminating information that cost him his life. Others whispered of shadowy figures owed a debt or double-crossed in clandestine dealings. The more outlandish stories spoke of elaborate conspiracies, painting him as both victim and perpetrator in a grand chess game none could fully comprehend. In press conferences, law enforcement officials maintained their stance. The investigation was ongoing, leads were being pursued, and the public would be informed when concrete developments emerged. Yet these assurances did little to quell the mounting speculation. As days turned to weeks and weeks to months, David Fuller's name became emblematic, a riddle that ignited countless conversations around dinner tables and online message boards. People dissected every frame of surveillance footage and rehashed every possible angle, from ballistic data to minute inconsistencies in witness accounts. Close scrutiny of his final days, those 24 fateful hours, left investigators with a wealth of tiny details, but no definitive thread to tie them into a coherent narrative. Why did he purchase those zip ties at the hardware store? Were they linked to the confrontation in the alley? Did the shredded documents in his home contain evidence that could clarify his predicament? Every fact uncovered seemed to raise new uncertainties rather than provide clarity. Meanwhile, the media continued its unrelenting coverage. Documentaries cropped up, featuring ominous music and sweeping aerial shots of the crime scene, each promising to unveil the real truth behind David Fuller's demise. The public devoured these programs, fascinated by the idea that an ordinary person could be thrust into extraordinary circumstances. Some repeated the claim he was a tragic figure, caught in a web of betrayal. Others framed him as a man with dark secrets that finally caught up to him. Still, a vocal minority questioned whether the entire event was staged. Could he have faked his death to evade a reckoning for past misdeeds? Amid this firestorm, the single undeniable reality was that David Fuller was gone, his life cut short in a manner both abrupt and brutal. In his wake, he left behind a swirl of enigma that transformed him from a subdued presence into something of a modern legend. His final 24 hours dissected in minute detail, yet perpetually elusive. The official file remained open, yet no fresh revelations emerged to bring a sense of closure. With each passing week, the frenzy of public interest began to wane, replaced by a quiet, unresolved ache that lingered wherever his name was mentioned. Unanswered questions cast long shadows. Could the unknown caller that afternoon have delivered a warning or a threat? Was the hooded figure in the alley someone he recognized, or a chance encounter gone horribly wrong? If the shots were indeed fired at close range, why was there no sign of a struggle? The tabloids had moved on to fresh scandals, but the puzzle of David Fuller's demise endured, lodged like a splinter in the collective consciousness. In the end, David Fuller became more myth than man, a cipher onto which any narrative could be projected. He served as a reminder of how swiftly an unremarkable life can be consumed by cataclysmic events, and how easily the quest for truth can dissolve into a labyrinth of speculation. Stripped of explanations, he left the world with a cliffhanger that no definitive evidence could fully resolve. For many, this lack of closure only deepened the allure, fueling conspiracies that refused to fade even as official channels fell silent. And so, we arrive at the lingering question: was his death merely a product of unfortunate timing and hidden grudges, or did a more calculated scheme lie behind those final moments? Even as investigators quietly filed away the case's day-to-day updates, and analysts turned their attention to fresh mysteries, the specter of David Fuller remained. The faint outlines of his routine life, the seemingly insignificant choices of that last day, and the shocking violence that punctuated its end. Together they formed a story that captured the collective imagination. In the quiet hush that follows, one last echo resonates. Sometimes the darkest truths remain forever hidden, and sometimes the most ordinary lives can harbor the most extraordinary secrets.